So now that you know the basics behind IP version 4 and IP version 6 addresses, we're now going to turn our attention to static versus dynamic IP address assignment. And I want to talk about the differences between static versus dynamic. So with a static IP address assignment, that's where you or I or a network administrator or an IT professional goes into a system and they manually type in and assign an IP address to that system. When that's done, the IP address does not change unless somebody goes into that operating system and manually changes it. With dynamic, it's going to be dynamically configured via something such as a DHCP server or a PIPA or stateless auto configuration. And the thing with dynamic is that it can change. So for example, with DHCP, you're actually given a lease for an IP address. And we're going to talk about how that works later in this section. But if your lease expires and your machine has been shut off for quite some time and a new machine goes onto the network, they can actually take that IP that you're using. And when you go to renew your lease, the DHCP server is going to give you a new IP because your old IP was given out to another machine. And then with a PIPA and the stateless auto configuration, they're going to be checking to make sure there's no duplicate IPs on the network. So the same thing can occur. If you log back into your system, you turn it back on. If another system's taking that IP address, well, then you can be assigned a new one. So that's the difference between dynamic and static. There are also best practice scenarios. Certain devices, we want them to have a static IP address where it doesn't change. And other devices, we don't care if the IP address changes. So for systems where we don't want the IP address to change and we want it to be configured manually via a static assignment, that's typically going to be a server such as a DNS server or a web server or a network printer or your router default gateway. We don't want those to change because that can cause issues on the network. We want them to be static. And also from an administration perspective, it's going to be easier to administer them because if I want to type in the IP address to it, I don't have to go and look up the IP address and see how often it's changed. It's just sitting there, it's static, and it makes it easier for me as an IT administrator. Now, in terms of devices where we don't care if it changes, that's typically going to be end user devices such as desktops, client systems. We don't care if the IP address changes. It's not going to cause any sort of an issue on the network. So with an end user device such as a desktop or a laptop or a smartphone, those are typically going to be set up to pull an IP address from a DHCP server or something else. Whereas with a server, we're typically going to use a static IP address assignment. So that's going to go ahead and conclude this introductory lecture for this section. We're going to take a bit more of a deep dive look into some of this stuff in this section, and you'll get a better idea of how it works.